My name's Mrin. I'm from India. I never thought I would be an artist. When I was young, my parents moved to France, and my mom was doing her PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris. And so we sort of grew up running around the museum where she was using the library. And then we moved back to India, and I moved into architecture, and I practiced for almost a decade in Delhi. I still don't see myself as a traditional artist, or the interdisciplinarity is like a very strong part of my work, and my work is still in response to and in relationship with architecture in a very fundamental way. In 2019, 2020 is when I started this current project called Field, with which I use lawn grass and develop it into a bioplastic and use that as an art material. I use trees, branches, sort of various materials from landscape that is like site specific to a location and a place. So sometimes I do bigger sculptural projects that are more site specific, where everything is gathered from the site, and sometimes I do sort of smaller, more contained, more like gallery-esque pieces. It's one thing to make a material, it's a whole other thing to learn how to fabricate with it. It has like 30% shrinkage, it has very specific properties. But I feel like over the last few years, I've really just been learning what it is, how it wants to be. The fiber is like in my mind, a really important and beautiful part of the material. And sort of, I'm often just working with my fingers, leading the fibers, and sort of both making sure it stays strong and the fibers properly interconnect, but also sort of formally working with thinking through the grass. So while there's a pretty stringent process, once I start actually working with the material, it just does what it wants to do, and I'm sort of responding with it, collaborating with it. So I'd say it's sort of like a hybrid between paper and a vegan leather. So it's soft, it has sort of, it can be more fabric-like, but they're 100% biodegradable, sort of compost, so they can be sort of left out in the wild and go back to the earth, which is a very important part of the work for me. I've worked with a lot of people from urban design, architecture, interior, industrial design, material design, electronics. We did a residency at this robotics lab where we like 3D printed with this bioplastic, and I couldn't have done it without like the help of like so many people who are so talented in what they do, that a lot of the basis of Field, of this idea of this grass field, even though it's a kind of abject meadow lawn in like an industrial city, has the room for everybody. All sort of disciplines, all forms of life have something to contribute to each other. I think Utica is a very interesting city that has a lot of sort of similarities with some of the other sort of post-industrial cities around the region. I've spent a lot of time in Holyoke in Massachusetts, which used to be paper mills. And I know that Utica has a lot of sort of former textile mills. And I think that there's just so many historic buildings around town that are like disused or dilapidated. And I'm really interested in those spaces, and I do show a lot of my work in those spaces. I kind of find them more interesting than galleries. Like in India, we don't have spaces that are underutilized. Like every inch is needed. Our cities are growing and growing and growing and growing, and our populations are hugely abundant. So I think this is like a very unique setup in the United States. And so there's these like seemingly vacant spaces, but that, in my opinion, seem haunted by absence, haunted by those that are not here. I think that most artist spaces, artist studios, spaces that cities that artists move to, spaces that artists go to, usually begin in these kinds of conditions. That okay, if something is disused or sort of obsolete, we're happy to intervene. We're happy to reuse and reimagine how they might be used. I think often that's exploited as well. You can't imagine New York City without its artists. Most spaces that are thriving with culture are because a bunch of sort of poor artists showed up and were like, how can we make something from nothing? How do we hybridize identity, ecology, and economics, supply chains? Which I think these like disused buildings are so important to, because it's always more fun to make something new. It's less exciting to like see what we have and adapt and reuse and recycle and sort of and still have beauty and still innovate and still create something magical, something new. One of my favorite artists, Muriel Lederman-Ukeles, who wrote this manifesto of care and called it maintenance art, which are like new in a Western conception, but I think in the East, this idea of maintenance, of care, of the people who provide the service of care are still sort of seen as part of an artistic process, part of a creative process. But I think in the West, the emphasis on sort of newness and on commodities has shifted that. So I think there's like a lot of potential in cities like this if we are willing to like sit with the trouble, sit with the dirt. It's good when things are already messy. I can be messy. I can like exist here 24/7. I have food, I have water, I have people, I have a community, I have tools. I can make a mess. Nobody's getting angsty or precious about it. And I think those are like very fundamental conditions that we need to like produce something new without a thought about its consumption.